Our March trip to Siargao took an unexpected turn when, instead of only staying for a couple of days, we, or at least I, ended up staying for close to 5 months. There were some ups and downs along the way, a lot of uncertainty about what currently is happening on the island, back home in Cebu, the country, and the world in general. But overall, our stay was quite enjoyable. We met a couple of people who made our stay fun and memorable. And although I'm quite happy to be back home with my friends, family, and dogs, I quite miss the island life and all that it has to offer. I've been coming to Siargao a couple of times a year since I started surfing, close to 4 years. During those visits, I did meet a lot of people, but mostly tourists who were bound to leave the island eventually. I only knew very few locals, but all my visits have been memorable in their own right. In hindsight, staying in Siargao for a couple of months has always been our plan, and by our, I mean my friend Karen and me. Our March trip had a goal of finding a suitable place to live when we come back on June to August. Our friend Sam, who also has a business in Siargao, also came with us back to the island, and we ended up staying at our friend Leia's hostel, Malaya. This would be my second stay at her place. We arrived on March 13th and was hell-bent on surfing that day since it has been a couple of months since Karen had surfed last. As for me, I had a surf trip in January in Lanuza and another one in February in Baler. But I was equally excited to catch some waves in some of my favorite spots in and around General Luna. Now, we did hear about the coronavirus scare happening in China and fast spreading around the world. At this point, there was still no travel ban in place in the Philippines, but airports and ports were already enforcing screenings to check for symptoms. But the virus, so new and poorly understood, there were a lot of lapses. It wasn't until the announcement on Saturday, March 14th, that Manila would be placed under lockdown that we felt the seriousness of the situation. Immediately, Cebu, who hasn't had any reported cases at this point, also announced it would be closing its borders on March 18th, 4 days away. Fearing we would be unable to enter the city, we immediately booked return tickets on the same day. We were confident we had enough time to get back to Cebu before it goes into lockdown. We were wrong.
For important announcements and information for a possible rescue flight.
The realization that our stay would be extended was met with somber excitement. We didn't know if we would be able to stick it out for 1 month in Siargao with a limited budget, but at the same time, we would now have more time to surf and just enjoy the island life. It seemed like an opportunity to surf to our heart's content. Siargao also closed its borders to contain the spread of the virus, so at least our minds were put at ease knowing there's little chance the virus could get to us. The border closure also meant no tourists were entering the island, which forced almost all hotels, hostels, and other accommodations to adjust their prices. Where we were staying, we were offered a discounted rate of 7,000 pesos per month for a single air-conditioned room that's good for two. As for food, eateries continued to stay open, which were relatively cheap, and we also had the option to cook in the hostel's shared kitchen. And because both Karen and I brought our laptops with us, work was not a problem. So we were pretty much set to stay longer in Siargao. We thought we were handed a very rare opportunity. The island was close to tourists, surf spots would have no crowds, and the prices dropped low enough for us to afford to stay longer. It was a dream come true, or so we thought. The announcement to ban all gatherings didn't have us worried. We were not the type to go and party a lot anyway. And it's another reason to fully enjoy the island as it once was. Then, they banned anyone from going out without any quarantine pass, which we would need to apply for. And then came the curfew. And finally, they banned surfing altogether. At first, we didn't take the announcement seriously, although we still didn't actively try to break it. We sneaked very early in the morning to surf, leaving before daylight, surfing for about an hour, and then returning right as people started waking up. It wasn't until we were met with officials in the borders and in the surf spots that we decided we had to stop our dawn patrol activities. But we still didn't completely stop surfing. We would wait a couple of days before trying to sneak out to surf in another spot. Again, only just a handful of us, and still, very early in the morning, we would rest for a couple of days after hearing of other surfers getting caught before trying our luck once again. We would do this a couple more times until they finally lifted the ban on surfing. The entire island, or at least the avid surfers, heaved a collective sigh of relief of being allowed back in the water once more. My God, wake her up!
All combined!
Nice video.
Ikaw na to, si Caridad.
No.
Mo muna Caridad.
I've heard of stories from Karen and other people who have been surfing way longer than I have about the old Siargao they once knew. The quiet fishing village with only eateries and a single bar to keep everyone fed and entertained. They talked of unpaved roads and quiet nights, of uncrowded surf spots and a closer community before it became the surf capital of the country. I think the island returned to what it once was during the lockdown. The first 2 weeks of ECQ, enhanced community quarantine, saw deserted streets even during the day. Only a handful of people were allowed to go out, and even then, police would routinely ask for our quarantine pass. The nights were even quieter. Since mass gatherings were banned, and any form of public gathering was prohibited, people were left stuck at home or in hostels or resorts. For us, days were spent working, and at night, we were left to our own devices if we weren't already drinking. We were in the middle of May when we realized we weren't leaving the island anytime soon. The ECQ status of Cebu kept getting extended as the cases soared. Its borders remained closed, and ferries only allowed cargo and absolutely no passengers. Plus, being stuck in the hostel for 2 months had us feeling a little antsy. A case of cabin fever, if you will. Karen and I decided that we would pursue our original plan of staying on the island. And so, we started looking for a house to rent. Because of the lockdown, the rent on the island has since dropped, seeing that no tourist was getting in. We found a nice little cottage in General Luna, close enough to the town center but situated a little farther back from the main road to be deemed peaceful enough. Our move to a place of our own meant another adjustment period. We were already used to a lot of people around us from having lived at a hostel. The peace and quiet in our own place took some getting used to. Days started to blur together. We surfed in the morning or in the afternoon, depending on the tide, and spent the rest of the day working. We would hang out with a few friends on some nights and on weekends, but suffice it to say, we have firmly established a routine and we were settling down into our island life. It was never in my cards to live in Siargao, despite what so many people have said to me. Yes, we were living the dream while the rest of the world struggled to maintain some semblance of normalcy. We had work to sustain our island life, people to hang out with, and the ocean to play with. But I had this gnawing feeling at the back of my mind that Siargao wasn't it for me, at least not right now. I've met people who have uprooted their lives elsewhere to live the island life, and they all seemed happy and content with their decisions. But I had a hard time looking through their perspectives. It all boils down to it wasn't time yet.
Wait, but Chili Girl! Oh, wait, oil? Yes! I'm in! Bob! Pero we're still friends. We're still friends.
And so I continued my plans for my return to Cebu. It was my conviction to try and go back home the moment the city opens its ports once again. That day came at the end of July, with Cebu placed under General Community Quarantine, GCQ. Inter-island travel commenced, and so I could start processing all that I need to get through all the checkpoints on my way back home. Surprisingly, it took less than a week to gather all the paperwork for my travel. I was expecting at least a week's worth of wait before I could get clearance to leave. Mine took less than 5 days.
You can always.
Oh, sorry. It's a video.
What's that?
I won't post it until tomorrow.
Baso. Ay. Yes, very nice.
Palaran.
Second book ko.
Where's the cinema?
Cinema!
We need that flex.
The journey back home served to open my eyes to the reality that things have completely changed outside of the little bubble many of us were living in General Luna. In my mind, I knew major towns and cities mandated the wearing of masks, but it was quite jarring to see literally everyone in face masks and sometimes face shields, from Dapa, Surigao City, all the way to Cebu. Coming from someone who only ever had to wear one when police were nearby or when entering an establishment. My journey home became an eye-opening experience of how it's going to be from now on. People wore masks everywhere, borders were strict, and there were very few people who were traveling. It was a rude awakening and offered a small glimpse of how it's going to be when I get back to Cebu. It wasn't smooth sailing going back home. I left on a rainy morning. There were border checks every leg of my journey, more paperwork to do in Surigao City, a day spent waiting to board the ferry to Cebu, and even more border checks when I got in the city. It wasn't an ordeal, but it certainly wasn't the same travel experience I had in March when my journey first began.